this is Wes McDermott. Welcome to the third video in Chapter 1 Fundamentals. In this video, we're going to talk about game objects, prefabs, and components. Game objects are the heart of all Unity projects, and so in this video, we're going to take a look and see what it's all about. In the previous section, when we were discussing Unity packages, I mentioned game objects and prefabs. So what we're going to do in this section here is talk about what those elements are. So let's first start thinking about what a game object is. So let's just say that we've got this little object here. It's kind of like a container, and this is our game object. Okay, so we have this little guy here, and we'll kind of fill it in. So think of this guy as kind of like a container. Okay, so a game object is very important in Unity. Everything that's inside of Unity, everything that you work with in Unity is a game object. And like I said, the game object, the way I look at it, it's like a container, and you put things into this container. So before we actually talk about, what are we putting into the container, let's think about the game object as how it relates to 3D space. So a game object, if you create an empty game object, it's essentially just a point in space. And that point in space has positioning, so X, Y, Z. And on every single game object, the first thing that you'll have when you look at it in the inspector is that it has translation, rotation, and scale parameters that all equal, that relate to X, Y, Z. So you've got, basically a vector for all three of these guys. So translation, X, Y, Z, you have rotation, and then you also have scale, all on the X, Y, Z axes. So you have a game object, which is a container. Everything inside of Unity is a game object, and this game object has the ability to place it in 3D space. So think of it again, it's this point in space with X, Y, Z. So now back to this game object and what we're actually going to place into it. So like I said before, we have our game object, and we want to place into it components. So what's a component? Well, the component could be a number of things. It could be a script that you write. So a component could be a script. A component could be a piece of audio. It could be a renderer. It could be a material. There's a host of things, and we'll talk about, and I'll actually show you what these components are when we get over to the Unity interface. But it could be any of these type of things here. So anything that you basically attach or add to a game object. So let's just say we have this game object, and then one of the things that we can do with this game object is say, okay, I have this game object, and I want it to render. So you add a mesh. So we'll say renderer. Maybe on this, I'll say mesh renderer, and in order for it to render, we'll attach a mesh renderer to it. And let's say that we then want to be able to control that game object. So we would write a script, and we would attach that script to the game object. So now the game object knows a position in space, it renders a mesh, and it has a script applied to it. Maybe if it makes some type of collision, so that's another thing, we might have a rigid body attached to it, so some type of physics. So a rigid body could be another component. And let's just say that our guy here has a rigid body component, so now that's going to work with the physics engine. Maybe there's a collision on the rigid body and we want an audio to play, so we might throw some audio into it. Another type is particles, so say we might have some particles attached to this game object. So maybe again we've got the game object is controlled by a script. The script is controlling the rigid body component that's on this game object. The game object collides with another game object that has its own set of components attached to it, and it plays a piece of audio, little audio clip that there was a collision sound, and then it makes a particle, like maybe sparks or explosion or something like that. So here's our particle renderer. Then we also have that guy on here. So all these type of components are getting added or placed into the game object. And the game object is, like I said before, it's very important to Unity because everything in Unity is a game object. So the main takeaway from this is to think about everything you do in Unity is you're going to create a game object for it. You're going to drag that game object into your scene. You're going to attach components to it. And then you're going to manipulate those components, or those components are going to produce some type of effect, whether it be through scripting, whether it be audio, whether it be a rendering, whether it be with, again, saying using the physics engine with rigid body or something like that. And those are what's going to end up that collection of game objects. So, this is just one piece of game object. Maybe this is a character. So maybe this is our character here. Maybe we have another one that makes up our environment. Maybe we have another one that makes up particle that's just particle effects and all these things. But if you can imagine, you're basically stacking like all these game objects or placing all these game objects together, and as a collective whole, these guys end up creating your game. So now let's jump over to Unity and actually take a look at what this actually looks like. Okay, so here we are inside of Unity, and again, we haven't talked about the UI much, so don't worry so much if you don't know what I'm actually doing. We'll discuss that in Chapter 2. But for now, just know that we've got our scene view here, so this is just like our perspective view, and the only thing we're really going to look at is just the scene view and this hierarchy view. So this is kind of like an outline of what our game is going to be, or where how all of our objects are in our scene. And so what we're going to do right now is we're going to talk about game objects, prefabs, and components. So first thing I'm going to do at the very top of the UI, you can see that, again, I remember I mentioned game objects was extremely important in Unity, and so we have its own little drop-down menu here. So we'll click this here, and you can see that I can create an empty game object, or I can create another game object. So remember I told you that game objects are basically everything in Unity. So if we go to create other, you can see that I can create a particle system, cameras, I can create lights here. So we've got different types of lights, such as spotlight, area, and directional. We've got a couple 3D objects. So let's go ahead and just create ourselves a cube. So I'm going to create the cube, and that puts a 3D cube into my scene. So what I'm going to do is just kind of zoom in on this guy, and we'll just focus in on him. Again, we're not going to worry about navigation or anything like that. This is just specifically talking about game objects. So now I've got this cube here, and if I look over here in my hierarchy view, I have this cube. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to rename this guy just for the sake of our discussion here. I'm going to say this is our first game object. Okay, and so now we've got this guy here in our scene that's called first game object. And what we're going to do is I'm going to go ahead and for right now just close out the game view because we don't want to even look at any of this type of UI stuff too closely. So we've got this cube, first game object, and what I want to show you right now is over here in the inspector. So here's our game object. The game object, remember that's our container, has a point in space. So if I kind of look around in this 3D view here, we've got some manipulators here, a transform manipulator. So you can see that I can move this guy across the X, the Z, and the Y. So this game object is actually a point in space. And then over here in the inspector, this whole area right here, this is where all of the components get added. So without any type of components, all this guy is just a point in space. And I'm going to illustrate that right now, but first thing that we'll do is we'll come over here to game object, and I'm just going to create an empty game object, okay? And let's just take this first game object for right now. I'm just going to move it just out of the way, okay? So we don't even see it. And I'm going to click this game object that we see right here. And so this is an empty container. And as you can see, that it's just a point in space. If I don't have it selected here in my hierarchy, we can't even see it. So I don't even know where it is. So again, if I select this game object, and you can see that we now it actually has a point in space because of the, since I'm using the move tool, or the transform manipulator, you can see that it's actually showing something that we could click on, a point in space. If we come right over to the inspector, this is where we start to see that transform I talked about. So every game object, even if it's completely empty, it still has a point in space. So we can see that it has position, X, Y, and Z values. It has rotation values, and it has scale values. So without any components, this thing is invisible. There's nothing to it. It doesn't render. It doesn't do anything. All it is just a position in space. Now, what's kind of cool about this is that we could use this game object. Again, we talk about being containers. Maybe this game object, even though you can't see it, doesn't do anything, but I could actually use it for organizational purposes in this case. So let's just say that we have this guy, this game object here, and I'm just going to just left click, drag and drop him right on top of this game object, and now he's basically inside. So remember we talked about containers. We took this first game object and placed it inside of this game object. So we can stack these guys this way. And it's a good way for organizational purposes. So I could just take this guy and select this, and I could say this is my environment stuff. So we could just label this guy environment. And so this first game object, it's empty. You can see over here we've got nothing, no components. All it is just think of it like a folder or just this container to hold everything else in. Now let's grab this game object and let's just zoom out into space here. Here he is. Let's just move him back into our view so now that we can see this guy. So let's really take a look at this guy in terms of components. So we've talked about our transform. We know what that is. I'm going to take this little left arrow and just click on it, and it's going to just kind of close it up so we don't have to worry about it. And I'm going to expand this guy. So what you see beyond that is a couple of components here. Okay, and if we click this Add Components button, we get this little window here. And there's all these types of components that we can add. We could also come up to the top of the UI and go to Component, and now you can see that here's the same list. So let's look at some of these components we had. We talked in the last kind of whiteboard section that we said that there were effects and physics and all that kind of stuff. So mesh. We can create a mesh filter, a mesh renderer, effects. We can create particle systems, lens flares, physics. We've got all kinds of physics. We've got colliders here. We've got rigid body, stuff like that. Navigation. So these are navigation elements. We've got the audio I was telling you about. So audio source and listeners. We can even throw in some like distortion and reverb filters and stuff like that. Rendering, camera. So even the camera in your scene. Again, if we kind of scroll back and we take a look at, we kind of grab hold of this camera here that's sitting in our scene, even the camera is a component. It's all it is. So if we take a look at it, all the camera is, you want to make a camera in your scene, it's real easy. You just select this environment. You could go to Add Component. You could go down to Rendering, and you could say, go ahead and click on this guy and say Camera. And then look what happens. We have another camera in our scene right here. So I'm just going to undo that. But what I'm trying to illustrate there is that, even a camera, lights, all that kind of stuff, they're all just simple game objects, and all we're doing is just what makes them different. One game object different from another game object is how it's being used in the scene, what components are attached to it. So again, we come down to rendering. You can see that we've got cameras, we've got lights, that kind of stuff. There's some miscellaneous stuff like animation and animator stuff, so if you want to be able to animate these things. Scripts. Now, you see a lot of scripts here. This is going to be different because what you're... Let me go back here. What you're seeing here in these scripts are just the scripts that you would find that's actually in your project. So a blank project, you probably wouldn't see anything here. And then some image effects. So we've got image effects, which are basically post-process screen rendering effects or whatever. Again, we won't go into that now, but you may or may not see anything in these two categories depending on if these elements are added into your assets project. So let's go back to our cube, and we'll just kind of zoom back in on this guy, and we'll focus in on him. So this guy, what does he have? He has a mesh filter of a cube, and he has a box collider. So it's maybe a little bit hard to see. Let's see if I can go into this. What I'll do is I'll just turn the mesh renderer off. There we go. And you can see this box collider. So this box collider here is used in our physics. So if we have a physical simulation going, we want to be able to check if one object is colliding or hitting or knocking into another object. We need to have a collider on that. So that's all this is here. And then, like I told you before, we have this mesh render. So we have a mesh filter here that's basically giving us this cube shape, but we don't see anything unless you have a mesh renderer component to that. So what I need to do is turn on the mesh renderer, and now we see we have a cube. So as part of the mesh render, it says, can this thing cast shadows? Can it receive shadows? Here's a drop down for its material. What's its material? Things like that. So the mesh renderer allows you to actually have a material, have it be rendered by the scene, and all that kind of stuff. And so another thing that we can actually illustrate with these guys is if we kind of come up here to this transform. Actually, again, remember I told you a point in space. So I showed you a moment ago how we can move this guy around. We can also scale this guy. So I'm just going to grab hold of the scale tool. And I'm just going to, you can see that I can scale this guy up. I can move him on the X and Y. So there's actually scale properties of this guy. And then I can actually rotate this guy around in space. And you can see that over here in underneath our transform, all these numbers are changing to correlate to how we're actually manipulating this guy in space, whether it be rotation, scale, or movement. So again, the big thing is that you have a game object and you add components to that. Components are, again, real easy to add. You may just click Add Component. Maybe we want this to have the audio to it, so we'll come in here and say, give me an audio source. Okay, so now it's going to say we've got this audio source, and it's going to ask for an audio clip. So we could just drag and drop an audio clip from our project and place it in here, and we can do some things like have it loop, we can change volume and pitch and things like that. You can add as many components to this as you want, but the main thing to think about, and it's very fundamental to understand, that the game object is essentially everything in Unity. So every item, everything you work with is a game object. And like I told you before, what you're doing here is you have your scene, this is your world, this is the world that you want to create. You create game objects, you arrange them into the scene, you add components to them, and the way that all of your objects and components interact together is what actually builds and makes up your entire game. Okay, so we've talked about game objects, we've talked about components, and the last thing we're going to talk about is the prefab. So the prefab, all that is just a short way of saying prefabricated element. So it's just a reusable object. They're used very, very often in Unity, and it's a real time saver a lot of times because, like I said, you can reuse these elements. So it's real simple. Let's just say that here we are in our project, and I'm just going to create a folder, and I'm going to call this guy, let's just call this folder here my prefabs. So we've got this little prefabs folder, and then what I want to do is, let's just say that we have this amazing element here, this first game object, and it's this awesome cube that has a box collider, and it allows us to add an audio source to it. And just for the heck of it, let's just say that one other thing I'm going to do real quick is just go to create a script, and we're going to say geo script. So and then all I'm going to do is I'm just going to select our first game object, and I'm just going to take the script and just left click, drag and drop it on here. So you could see that that was just another way that I add a component. Now I'm going a little fast here. Don't worry about what I just did, creating this script and all that stuff. We're not talking about any of that kind of stuff yet. But all I'm doing right now is we're just talking about the fundamental aspect of, that we have a game object, that there's these components attached to it, and now we want to make this into a reusable element that we can reuse throughout our project and stuff like that. So in this case, what I wanted to show was that we've got this cube, we've got audio source on this guy, and then there's some type of script on this guy that does something, some magic thing that I don't know what it does, but it makes our game really, really cool. And so we've got this guy, and we've got the first game object. Okay, now what we could do is you could actually duplicate this guy in your scene. So now you have several of these guys. But something else that you could do as well is that you could actually select this guy, and you could create a prefab out of that. So the big difference between duplicating this and creating a prefab out of it is the prefabs are instances of what you're creating here. So that means that if you make, say you have a prefab that's in your scene that it's all over your scene, maybe you have like 12 or 13 of them, and you make one change to the prefab, it will propagate to all the other prefabs in your scene. And so let's just go ahead and take this guy, and we'll just delete that out of our project. Let's take this guy and let's create a prefab out of that. So to do that, I'm going to just select this prefabs folder. Again, it doesn't have to be this way. You could create a prefab anywhere, any way you want. I'm just doing this for organizational purposes. But say we've got this folder selected, and I want to just place a new prefab in there. And so this new prefab is going to be called, here, we'll just call this first prefab. So we've got this guy, this empty prefab here. And then all you have to do is just left click, drag and drop that object right onto the prefab. And now we've created a prefab element out of this guy. If we select this prefab here in our project, you can see that it shows the cube, and it also shows all of the materials, or excuse me, all of the components attached to that prefab. And now here on our screen, you can see that this guy is now blue. So what we'll do is, let's just say that this was part of our this was an element here that we created. Let's take this prefab now, and let's drag another one out, and just drag and drop it into our scene, and we'll move this one over this way. Let's drag another one into our scene, and we'll move it over this way. So now we've got 3 of these guys. Now these guys, these first prefabs, are instances. So if we go into this prefab, and let's say we make a change, so let's just say that we start to scale this guy on the axis, you can see that all the prefabs are changing for us, which is really cool. Let's say that we go into the scale and we change the Y scale here. Let's just say that there was something about the audio. Let's say that these were like pillars in our game. So let's say like this was just like a level here, since I have this under this environment. And this is like kind of the boundaries of our game. And if you get close to these guys, this special sound goes off. And let's just say that we've got this audio clip, and I want to change the audio. So let's just say in our boundary we've got 100 of these things all the way around our scene. And each one of them has this audio clip, and every time the player gets near it, I want to change it. Well, what if I had to go through and change that for 100 different items? Well, you don't have to do that. All you'd have to do is just select the prefab, take our new audio file, just drag and drop it right onto this audio clip, and then all the prefabs, since this is a prefab, all the prefabs in the scene that are actually in our environment would automatically take that change. So we could then replicate a change or propagate a change throughout several game objects, by doing it one time. So that's the power here of a prefabbed element. Okay, so we covered quite a few things in that, but the main takeaway is, don't worry about, all the things I was doing in the UI and all that kind of stuff. The main takeaway that I want you to get from this is that everything in Unity is a game object. Game objects are essentially just containers. You add components to a game object, and that is how you build your entire game. So your entire game is built off of these game objects that have components to them, such as audio or mesh renderers or physics and scripts, and you attach these things to the game objects, and how they interact with each other is basically how your entire game comes together and how your game comes to life, so to speak. So that's going to cover everything in this video. In the next video, we're going to take a look at publishing builds of our games, and we're also going to take a look at some of the licensing differences that Unity offers.